Good morning. You've made it through 2 days already. You're in the final stretch, and thank you for being here. My name's Lloyd McKenzie. Many of you have already seen this slide, so I'm not going to talk about it much other than I've been doing FHIR for a long time and have some sense of what's going on. We're here today to talk about Release 5 because Release 4 is out, and who cares about that? It's the next thing that always matters to people. I'm going to try to give some sort of sense of what we think is going to happen. Of course, everything that I say is a future-looking statement, and what actually happens may be a little different from what we expect. If you go back and look at the presentations that we were giving out in 2014, things evolved a little differently than we thought that they would at that point, and that has continued to happen from every point forward. In terms of where we've been, we started with an official release of FHIR in 2014. It took us just over a year to put out the second release, and the second release is what really mattered to most folks. There were a few implementations that were based on Release 1, or sometimes even earlier releases than Release 1, but Release 2 is the one that really took off. After that, it took us about a year and a half to get Release 3 out. We had initially planned to get it out after only a year, and people said, please slow down a little bit, so we did. The biggest and most important release that we've had thus far is Release 4, which came out just at the end of last year. And it took us a while to get that out. There was quite a bit of work to do in actually locking down content and saying, yes, we agree that these resources won't change, at least not in ways that break backwards compatibility. In terms of Release 5, we are currently scheduled to publish in early 2021, ideally in January, but we don't know for sure. The timeline that we have right now calls for us to have a ballot in May, which technically means that we have a ballot in April. HL7's naming convention is that the ballot is named after when the ballot closes, as opposed to when it opens. So if you go to sign up in May, you're too late. You have to sign up for the ballot before it opens, or they don't let you in. That's ANSI's rules, not HL7's rules. We weren't terribly thrilled when they told us that, but that's what they said. And the intention there is a comment-only ballot. What that means in HL7 terms is we seek feedback, but we don't have to formally resolve all of the feedback that comes in. We generally try to anyhow, but it gives us a little bit of wiggle room from a process perspective. And our real objectives for that review is to make sure that the community is happy with what we're planning to lock down. Because if the community says, you know what, this isn't ready, and we look at it and go, yeah, you're probably right, then we can take that out of the normative ballot and we can change scope willy-nilly at this point. Once we go into September, when we plan to have our formal ballot process, there will be two review processes in parallel. By the way, for those of you who are not familiar, HL7 is a standards organization, and the way we decide what gets published as an official standard or not is go through a process called balloting, where anybody who wants to, who is either a member who wants to give HL7 money, happy either way, gets to provide feedback on the specification and say, this is awesome, or this is pretty good except for these two pieces which need to change, or this is total garbage and should not be published and it needs a complete rewrite. And people provide feedback along the full spectrum of those depending on their thoughts and opinions. And every piece of feedback that we receive gets reviewed by the work groups that are responsible for the content, and we make a decision as to, yes, we agree with you, or no, we don't agree with you, or we partly agree with you, and here's what we're going to do as a result. And for those who said, no, this should not pass, they get to look at the decisions of the work group. And if they say, yeah, I can live with that, then they can change their vote from no, this shouldn't be published to yes, this should. And if they disagree, they can say, no, I disagree, and here's why. And in that case, for normative, we go back out to everybody who voted and said, these are the people who have concerns. Here are the concerns that they have. Does anybody want to change their vote on that basis? And then we look at the final count of votes, and that determines whether or not we publish. And if the votes say we don't publish, then we sort of go back through the whole process again and figure out how we're going to create a specification that we can get a sufficient number of people to agree with. To pass normative, we need 75% of the people who participate in the vote to say, yes, this is ready. So we're looking for a pretty substantial agreement within the community. One of the things that we can do when we go to normative ballot is, based on feedback that comes in, we can say, you know what? Most people are happy, but there's these 3 things that are kind of broken and we need to make changes. And these are substantive changes, which means that if somebody had implemented on the current specification, they would be broken trying to talk to somebody with the new specification. So they would have to change their code in order to comply. If we need to make a substantive change, we have to go back through the ballot process again and see whether people agree with the revised version or not. Our hope is that we can get through the normative process with only 2 normative ballot cycles. So first one, everybody gets a chance to take a look. We identify anything that people think is broken. We fix it. They get to look again. We've done everything gloriously well, and the community agrees that, yes, this can pass with no more breaking changes. Last time around, it took 3 cycles, so it's possible that will happen this time as well. It's also possible, depending on the volume of feedback that we have, that getting everything that we need to have fixed between May and September will prove difficult, or everything that we need fixed between September and November or September and January could also prove difficult. In parallel with the normative ballots, we're going to have a standard for trial use ballot, which is a review of everything that is not being locked down as normative, which will be most stuff still. There's a lot of content in FHIR that is new. There is a lot of content in FHIR that has not yet been really well exercised by the implementer community, and we will not be trying to lock that down yet. Normative means that, in theory, that there won't be any breaking change. Generally, what it means in practice is that systems that worked with the previous version will work with the new version. So if you were conformant with release 4 for observation or patient, you can be confident that you will also be conformant with release 5 and release 6 and release 21 and however long we keep going. It does mean that we can still do certain changes. We can add new stuff. But we can't add new stuff that changes the meaning of what already exists. So anything that's new is safe to ignore. So it is possible when you're talking to an old system, they might throw away some of the data you send them, but that's reality even if you're sending to a system that supports the same version you do. I can send you a patient's name and you can throw it away because you deal with de-identified information and you don't want to see patients' names, and that is a legitimate behavior. There is a little bit of wiggle room. We can actually make breaking changes in a normative release, but we're pretty limited in terms of how we can do that. It needs to be in a situation where nobody's actually used that piece of the specification, which itself is somewhat suspect, because if nobody's used it, we shouldn't have taken it normative in the first place. We should have flagged that part and said, this is still trial use because nobody's used it yet. Or everybody who's using it says, you know what, this is totally broken. We didn't realize it before, but now we do. And the entire community says, yes, make this change. So it's a pretty high bar to make those sorts of changes, but we allow for the possibility of, if the entire community wants something fixed, we're not going to say, no, we can't fix it. We're going to leave it broken because it's now normative, because that would be a stupid thing for us to do. And we try not to be stupid more than the rules force us to be. An important part of FHIR is the notion of the maturity model, which is that we start out with things as draft, meaning we're working on this. This is a thing that we think we're probably going to have. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. It's not fully baked yet. It's probably not ready for production use yet. There might be things that are missing. There might be things that are just plain wrong. But we're trying to give you a sense of where we're going, and we appreciate review in terms of whether we're going the right way or not. And if you really feel brave, you can use it in production use. And lots of people do, because the reality is something that is in the specification and works with the tools and works with the schema and happens to meet their particular use case is totally fair game. What it does mean is that there is significant risk of that resource being different, or possibly even being gone or merged or completely refactored between this release and the next release, so they need to allow for that. Moving on from that, we have standard for trial use, which starts as at level 1. And that says, we think this is ready for production use. We've taken it as far as we can without having implementer feedback, and we would now like to have implementer feedback. So try it out in production, see what happens, and let us know. If things are broken, we will fix them, and if things aren't broken, then we will move things further up the levels. Level 1 is it's a paper spec. Nobody's actually written any code that tests and makes sure that this thing works yet, but it's as good as we can get without somebody actually writing code. Level 2 says we've written code and we've tried it out, and we've had several independent systems try talking to each other, and it's worked relatively well. Level 3, we've jumped through a whole bunch of hoops in HL7 processes. We've actually gone to ballot, and the balloters have said, yes, this looks good, and we've made sure that we've gotten proper definitions and proper quality assurance and a whole bunch of things there. Level 4 means that we've got at least trial use in production. We've formally published this as in part of an official specification. And level 5 says we're in production. We're in production in at least 2 different countries, at least 5 independent implementations. And both level 4 and level 5 say, if we're going to make breaking changes, we're going to talk to the implementer community first formally and say, are you comfortable with this change? Doesn't mean that we can't veto the implementer community, but I don't think we've ever done that, because in the end, the implementer community is who we need to use this for it to be helpful and useful for healthcare. And so the implementer community has a huge impact on whether we start making breaking changes once things have hit that level. As we move from release 4 to release 5, our objective is let's continue moving things up that maturity scale. So stuff that was draft should now be STU. Some stuff that was STU will now be normative, and some of the stuff that was down around level 1 or 2 should be up 3 or 4, maybe even 5. And so as the resources are around for longer and the community has a chance to exercise them more, we expect them to move up. If something is sitting at level 1 and it's been at level 1 for 3 releases, we're going to start looking at it and say, nobody seems to want this. Nobody's implementing this. Why does this exist? And we will sort of confirm with the community, is this something that's actually necessary? Is it just nobody's had time yet? Everybody's had more important things to do, but they will get to it eventually? Or is this somebody's idea of this would be really cool if, but it's fantasy world and nobody's ever going to go there? In which case we might start pruning stuff out of the specification, reflecting what it is that the community actually wants to have. In terms of where we have been and where I think we're going, this graph shows what resources we've had as draft, what resources we've had as standard for trial use, and what resources we've had as normative. Everything to the right of that red line is Lloyd's imagination. So take that for what it's worth. But the general trend that we expect to see is we're going to have new draft stuff showing up in releases for quite some time, because there will be new areas that are relevant in certain spaces in healthcare. And people will hear about FHIR and they'll go, hey, cool, I can use all of this stuff and all of this stuff, and I'm missing this piece. So we have resources coming in release 5 in the space of evidence-based medicine. So how do we represent the research that's happening in the medical space? That's not something that most EHRs are going to have anything to do with. They could care less about that stuff, but it's going to be important for some. And it's going to be important for certain types of applications. And so we will continue to see new things coming into this space over time. We started out with everything being pretty much standard for trial use. And then we began to have a little bit of normative stuff. And over time, we expect the amount of stuff that is normative to increase, and the percentage of stuff that is only standard for trial use to decrease. And I've split this into common resources and all resources. Common resources are things like condition and allergy and procedure and encounter, those things that most healthcare systems care about and need, and that are pretty important to making things work. But there's a whole bunch of other resources in FHIR, things like how do you manage the registration of a drug. Certain governmental organizations care very passionately about that, and pharma companies care very passionately about that, but it's not the kind of thing that most clinical systems have to worry about. So while the number of resources continues to increase, we're not expecting it to sort of zoom up into the thousands. We used to say we expect 100 to 150, but we really didn't expect some of the things that have come forward to come forward. More people are using FHIR for more diverse things than we sort of hoped to. We're not going to take everything on. We've had people from the airline safety space say we would like to use FHIR, and we've said, that's cool, but we'd really rather not add new resources for you. Go ahead and do whatever it is that you need to do, but we're not going to call some of your new stuff FHIR. But there are certain things like evidence-based medicine that is clearly healthcare related and is in our space, and we're taking those on. But the set of common resources, the things that most of us rely on, we're expecting a lot of those to go normative in Release 5, and even more to go normative in Release 6. And so there shouldn't be a whole lot by the time we hit Release 7 or Release 8 in the common space that is not locked down. But there will continue to be a reasonable amount of stuff in the not so common space that is not locked down, because we're going to be continuing to introduce new stuff over time. And we don't know exactly when that's going to stop, because the world continues to evolve and people continue to have new cool ideas, and we certainly don't want to shut those down. In terms of what is potentially a candidate for normative in Release 5, the answer is right now lots. We have not got a final list from the work groups in terms of, yes, this is absolutely in, this is not. Look to the May ballot in terms of what we are officially hoping to bring forward, and then look to the September ballot for what actually the community agreed we should take forward, which will probably be a subset of this. I doubt we're going to add anything. It's more likely we're going to yank a couple of things. One of these in particular I hope is going to get yanked. Vision prescription I think is going to get rolled into device request, but we'll see how that goes. In addition to moving these resources forward, which is one of the main things that we want to do, we have some other things that we hope to accomplish. We have been and continue to work on improving support for implementation guides. That is a space where both HL7's energy and the implementation community's energy is starting to move to, and has been moving to more and more, because the FHIR core specification gives you building blocks. It says here are the types of data that you can share, but it's not terribly tight about how those are used. We can't nail down terminologies for things like procedure codes or drug codes internationally because there is no consensus. And there's unlikely to be consensus anytime soon. In the area of billing codes, there's unlikely to be consensus in my grandchildren's lifetime. That's just the way that space happens to work. And so getting interoperability means that you need to provide tighter guidance on the use of resources in a particular space, and implementation guides are how we do that. We're trying to make them easier to create. We're trying to make them easier to review. We're trying to make them easier to reuse and to consume and to play nicely with each other, because all of that is important to having people use FHIR in a consistent manner. Another place that we're looking to improve things is driving a bit more consistency in how our resources represent information. There are places where sort of the same sort of concepts are being conveyed, but we're using different names or we're using different data types, or we say that things can be authored by practitioners and organizations and devices in one space, and we say they can also be authored by patients and related persons in another space. And sometimes there's good reasons for there being a difference that based on culture and legislation throughout the entire world, there's just no chance of patients and related persons ever creating those things, and so that's fine. But there are other places where, yes, that can happen, and the people who are authoring just didn't think about that part. And so we're trying to make sure that the places where we have variation are intentional as opposed to accidental. And so we're trying to build some tools that help sort of guide work groups to drive more consistency and also to document when they have inconsistency, why that exists and why that's appropriate and necessary, so that the people who are reviewing the specification can look at that and say, yes, that's right, we agree that that should be different, or no, we don't agree, and here's our evidence why your rationale for being different is actually not terribly sound. Obviously, we are continuing to introduce new content. And if you have ideas for things that should be in the specification, or you know what, FHIR would be awesome if it only did X, then come talk to us. At the bottom of every page in the specification is a propose a change link, and we invite feedback in terms of what you would like to see, what you think is broken, what needs to be added. We're continuing to try to improve support for multiple FHIR releases. We did a fair bit in release 4 around that, so that it was easier to negotiate and say, hey, I support release 3 and 4 and 5, and I, as a client, only happen to support release 3 and 4, and I'd prefer 4, and we can negotiate with each other and make communication happen. We're continuing to try to make that life easier, because the reality is there's going to be multiple versions in place in FHIR for quite some time where it will matter, where some of the resources will not be locked down and there will be breaking changes. And so we have to care about that. We're also working on embedding better support for language translations into the specification, so that people who want to see the spec in Russian or Japanese or other languages can do that. Making it easier to have queries that hit one server, get fanned out to other servers, and respond back. Also looking at migrating from legacy. So we're significant mapping exercises underway right now between version 2 and FHIR, and a bunch of work that's already happened between CDA and FHIR, and looking at how we can automate transforms there where possible, recognizing that implementations of version 2 tend to be pretty inconsistent, so one-size-fits-all transformation is probably not on, and the same is still somewhat true for CDA as well. We had hoped to send out a survey in August asking people what they wanted to see in Release 5, and then the Release 4 technical correction happened, and Graham's life kind of got disappeared for a while, because there were a number of things about Release 4 that turned out to be broken in the technical infrastructure, so we had to fix all of those. But we will be coming out soon, which now looks like December, seeking feedback, and that will be fed into our May draft ballot. Specifically, what are you using? How are you using FHIR? Are you comfortable with our proposed timeline? And some other questions about significant changes that we have made from Release 4 to Release 5 in resources that are Level 4 or Level 5 maturity, and making sure that the implementer community is comfortable with those things. One of the things that we have done around driving consistency in FHIR is introducing something called patterns. And we're trying to use those in a few different ways. One of them is to drive consistency, but another is to expose layers on top of FHIR for people who see procedure and allergy and encounter and several other resources and say, you know what, these are all event resources and I'd kind of like to manipulate them as a collective. and not have to worry about what specific kind of event it is. And so we're looking at moving some of that into our reference implementations. We're continuing to work on providing mappings to underlying structures, things like SNOMED. We've introduced a number of new patterns on the relationship side. So when I want to point to practitioner role, patient, related person, organization, device, that's a pattern that shows up a whole bunch of times. Can we give it a name so that we can actually drive better consistency? And there's some discussion right now around what are the underlying foundations for why we group certain resources together the way that we do. And can we use that to help us make sure that when we're pointing to an arbitrary collection of things, that we have a good reason for that particular collection and what we're including versus excluding. In terms of supporting implementers, obviously the implementation guide space and improving tooling there, better support for versioning, better support for languages, better support for transformation. We know that we want to work some more on the imaging space. We are starting to work on mortality and morbidity reporting. The financial resources are finally starting to get some serious attention, and we may be doing some rework there based on feedback. They've always been a little bit different than everything else, and sometimes that's been based on the fact that that area simply is different in healthcare, but sometimes it's because of historical ways that those transactions have been done that FHIR could allow to be done differently, and people weren't necessarily comfortable with the notion of doing things differently. But we don't want to bake in the old ways too firmly. We want to allow people to use REST in all areas of healthcare, even in those places that they haven't historically thought about that. We've got, actually just yesterday, we published the genomics reporting implementation guide as an official international specification. So they've been doing lots of work. And unlike a lot of work groups, once they get something out the door, they sort of give a sigh of relief and relax and coast for a little while. Even before the publication announcement had gone out, the amount of chatter on their discussion forum had pretty much doubled as they got excited about what they were going to do in the next release. So there's a very active community there. There's a lot of stuff happening in the research and pharma space where they're looking at FHIR, and it looks like they're going to come full steam. And there's a number of other accelerator projects, we call them in HL7, where different areas of healthcare are looking to FHIR and saying, yeah, I want into that. And there's a bunch of implementation guides to cover my area that I want developed. One of the other things that we're looking at how to do is how to be able to dump all of a patient's data. Right now, FHIR has been focused on these are the procedures, these are the allergies, these are the medications, sort of what are the common chunks that everybody has. But every EHR has some special set of data, whether it's because of the design of their particular system, or they've got a supplemental clinical trial running that's been capturing some stuff on the side. And as regulators look at allowing patients to be in more control of their data, the notion that, well, they can see most of their data, but some of it's still partitioned off and is EHR specific, is not feeling terribly comfortable. And so there is a pressure and desire to have the ability to expose all of it. And we're not quite sure how to actually make that happen in a practical way, but that's some of the marching orders we've been given as, please look at this and see what you can come up with. The FHIR core specification is, of course, a foundation for a number of other technologies, things like Smart on FHIR, CDS hooks, a new specification called FHIRcast. We have CQL, we have bulk data, and we expect there to be both more of those things as creative people show up and say, hey, now that I have this FHIR foundation, I can do cool thing X. And we go, hey, yeah, that's awesome, go do that. And there will be these additional specifications building on top of FHIR that will also be going through a maturity process as they work their way to normative, we promise not to make breaking changes anymore level. and we will be seeing new releases of some of those existing technologies, as well as new technologies coming out. Graham often talks about how the FHIR specification is two main pieces. There's the specification you see on the web, and there's the community, and they each form probably half of what FHIR is. And the community is often seen as being the more important half. The number of people who are looking at FHIR, the number of organizations who are leveraging FHIR continues to increase. And some of the organizations who are starting to make use of FHIR don't have a whole lot of experience in community consensus open processes. And that's a really important foundation for making FHIR work, because if you don't have an open community process, you risk creating specifications that don't get implemented, or that get pushed into the implementer space that end up not meeting needs and not delivering what people would like to see happen. So one of the things that we're working on right now is defining expectations that will be voluntary, because HL7 has zero power over other organizations, but we can at least say this is what we think should happen, and we invite you to sign up for that. And if you sign up for that, we'll give you a cool little sticker you can put on your website and your specifications, because stickers are awesome. And hopefully the power of a sticker will drive behavior that we would like to see. And so this is targeted not just at external organizations like SNOMED or IHE or CDISC or others who might want to play in this space, but also at projects that are coming in and working through HL7, but have at least some of their governance processes living elsewhere. So we have Argonaut, which works within HL7, but is driven by a bunch of, well, actually largely international, but US focused, at least in the Argonaut context, EHR organizations. We have Karen Alliance, which is pretty US-centric, focused on claims. We have DaVinci, we have Care Quality. There's a new one called Codex, which is on the oncology space. Gravity is in the social determinants of health space. And all of these different groups are forming and wanting to create specifications, and we want to provide some recommendations around how do you do that. So how do you make sure that your processes are open, that you're transparent, that you're inclusive of the community that's going to actually need to implement your stuff. That when you create stuff and you put it out there and implementers say, yeah, that's awesome, and they put it into their production code, and then 5 years later they need to change, and you're gone, what do they do? So making sure that we have plans in place so that the source for the specification is maintained and available, and that there are transition plans if somebody is a project that's going to exist for a fixed period of time and then might go poof because the funding goes poof, that we have transition to some other organization who can maintain that and provide implementer support. The other piece of this is coordination, because it is quite possible for 5 different organizations to all say, you know what, cancer is important, let's go and create some cancer standards, and they end up overlapping and defining different ways of solving exactly the same problem. We cannot stop that from happening, but we can at least provide a forum for discussing and saying, here's what we're planning to do, here's what the scope of it is, and identifying the fact that, hey, there's overlap between these two things, a little bit of overlap or a complete overlap, and having some discussion of, can we cooperate? Can we perhaps form a joint project? Or, well, you guys are pretty far along and we were just starting and we had no clue that this already existed, so yeah, we're not going to bother. We'll just send a couple of people over to join you and move your work forward, and so hopefully reduce the amount of overlap that we have and improve collaboration. So that is not nailed down yet, but we have broached the idea with a whole bunch of organizations, and there's quite a few that are on board with, at least notionally, with that. So we're working on some of the legal paperwork of what that will look like, and some of the not so legal paperwork that is human readable, that those of us who work in the organizations will care about and need to read. And somebody's also working on making the sticker nice and pretty and attractive so that it'll go well on the websites. So that is sort of what's happening in terms of R5. We're going to continue to work on the core spec, moving maturity up that scale, going from 0 to 5 to 6 as quickly as the community happens to be willing to move, which of course is driven by things like how much money do you have and how much time do you have and how much can you actually sleep. We will continue to improve support for the implementer space. And if there's other things that you need that aren't on the slides and you're going, but what about X? Please come and talk to me or Graham or raise an issue on chat.phir.org so that we know what you're looking for. Our answer might be, yeah, we would love that too. We have no clue how to get it. But the other possible answer is, yeah, we can absolutely do that. We didn't know that was necessary. And even if we don't know how to get you something, asking the question will at least mean that our eyes are open, looking for solutions, and maybe somebody out there in the community will have an idea of how to make it better. Implementation guides are really happening, and they're going to continue to grow, and we're making that as easy as we can. And new communities are continuing to pop up. When we started out with FHIR, our objective was to change, first of all, how do we build healthcare standards? We wanted to move them to a much more open way of development where anybody who wanted to participate could participate without having to put a bunch of money on the table, and that people could get access to the specifications, again, without putting a bunch of money on the table, and that the process was seen to be, and in actuality, free and fair for everybody who was going to be impacted by them. And at least within HL7, and to a large extent within the broader community, that either has happened or is in the process of happening. The boulder is sort of rolling down the hill, and if you try to stop it, you're going to not feel so good. Second thing is we wanted to change how healthcare interoperability technology works, changing how systems talk to each other, making that easier, making that less custom, where every interface is a separately maintained interface, and more a space where you create an interface and anybody who wants to talk to it can talk to it, obviously with security and access control in place, but where it's not one-off solutions all of the time. And we're getting there. We're a long ways from where we think we need to be, but the tools are in place and lots of implementations are moving that direction, and it's working, which in turn creates more momentum for other places to change. But all of that isn't really what we're about. Changing technology is fun and cool, and that's why most of us are here, because we like playing with technical things. But our objective is to change healthcare. Our objective is to make sure that patients, regardless of where they live, are getting better care, that clinicians have the tools in front of them to make better decisions, have information in front of them so that they don't order the same test twice, so that they don't order the drug that the patient is allergic to, that they're aware of the study that came out 2 months ago that says that doing this actually doesn't provide any benefit, and here's why. And so that we can be more efficient in how money is spent, and we can actually make people healthier and live longer and be happier. And some of that is technical. A lot of that is changing people, changing processes. And that we haven't really started on yet. And that is something that FHIR will also be paying attention to and trying to enable wherever it can. So that's where we hope things are going. Hope is a good thing. It's not a guarantee, but we'll do the best that we can. And thank you for being here to help us get there. I have 2 minutes for questions. I have 1 minute for questions. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you have any details about the work to help migrate from CDA documents to FHIR resources? Can you expand on that at all?
Sure. The question was, can I provide details on plans for migration from CDA documents into FHIR? There is a stream on chat.phir.org that is dedicated to mapping CDA and specifically CCDA into FHIR. Mapping CDA itself is really hard because you can say the same thing 50 different ways in CDA, so you really need to be mapping specific templates, and CCDA is probably the most widely implemented or the most widely aligned to set of templates that we have out there. And there's been a fair bit of work on that, both in terms of doing mapping, but also doing connectathons and testing and trying it with different kinds of documents and seeing what works in practice, as opposed to, yes, theoretically this maps, but when you look at real documents, it does not map so well. There's some challenges around mapping narrative because the boundary lines are not exactly the same in CDA and FHIR, but that's the best place to check and see where things are at. But it's really just the community coming together and saying, we need this. We've got a whole bunch of systems that have CCDA documents, and we really want to take that data and expose it in FHIR, and working as a community to try to make that happen.
Would it be more just the mapping aspect, or do you think like reference implementations would actually have code built into mapping?
So the intention, so the question was, is it just mappings, or are we actually going to see reference implementations? My understanding is that they are looking at using structure map. So we can express CDA as a logical model using structure definitions, and we can create structure maps that define computable syntax independent, so don't care JSON, XML, whatever, to convert from one syntax into another. And those will be published once they are final and tested and as good as we can make them. And many of the reference implementations know how to execute structure maps. If there is interest, it's not that hard to suck up a CDA XML and expose that as a FHIR structure definition instance. So yes, I do expect that to happen. I don't have timelines on when that's likely to happen, though. All right, and if there are more questions, that's where to find me, and we will see you on chat.phir.org. Thank you.